We're rolling? Okay. Thanks, everybody. So Jess Ottney Mahar, she's the Policy and Strategy Director for the Nature Conservancy in New York. She's got 2 decades of experience on public policy campaigns, and she's currently managing the Vote Yes for Clean Water and Jobs campaign in support of the $4.2 billion Environmental Bond Act that'll be on the ballot in November. So I'll toss it over to Jess. Thanks, Jess, for presenting for us today.
Sure thing. Thanks, Olivia. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be with you. I'm a Finger Lakes region kid, so I'm really happy to be speaking to the folks who are protecting the Finger Lakes area. So thank you for your work. This fall, we have a really exciting opportunity in that we will have a Bond Act on our ballot in November. This is the first environmental bond act that we've had in New York since 1996. So it's been a while. And it's a $4.2 billion measure. It'll be Prop 1 on the back of the ballot. So we're working right now to remind folks to flip their ballots and vote on this. It's focused on some key purposes. The Bond Act is really probably of interest to your organizations. There's $650 million for water quality improvement. And a lot of infrastructure funding there. There's also significant funding, more than $1 billion for flood risk reduction, which includes a lot of money for restoring natural resources. And there's a lot of intersection there with work on water quality and, aquatic ecosystems. But there's also funding for infrastructure there and making sure that our transportation infrastructure is upgraded. Issues like right-sizing culverts, which is great for, freshwater ecosystems where we need to see fish move through systems without barriers, but it's also important for reducing flooding in our communities. There's a lot in the Bond Act for reducing the pollution that's causing climate change. $1.5 billion will be dedicated to cleaner air. And that includes, again, a lot of strategies around natural resources restoration as well. And then finally, there's $650 million for open space and farmland conservation. So this is kind of the traditional, wildlife habitat conservation, farmland protection that's going on across the state and that we need more of into the future. So this is a really great measure that's going to focus on the big issues facing New Yorkers, the issue of needing clean water, as well as the causes and effects of climate change and conserving the resources that we depend on in New York State. We actually worked with AECOM, the engineering firm, to do a study. Their study found that the Bond Act will support nearly 100,000 family-sustaining jobs for New Yorkers. One of the key aspects of the Bond Act is it includes labor standards. So for construction projects, there's prevailing wage requirements. On very large projects, there's project labor agreements. But there's also apprenticeship programs and Buy American standards. So really working to make sure that this infusion into our economy is good for workers as well. And there's an important lens on this Bond Act that a third of it needs to be invested in disadvantaged communities. And some of you may be following the work that New York State DEC and NYSERDA are doing with the Climate Justice Working Group through our state's climate law to identify disadvantaged communities in New York State. These are places where people have been suffering environmental pollution, as well as other issues like poverty or unemployment or socioeconomic issues. And so the convergence of these things qualifies those communities for, consideration as we're implementing our state's climate law and funding measures like this. We want to make sure we're investing in these places so that the people who have been suffering most from environmental degradation are really a focus of this program. So we're urging everyone to get ready to vote for this. there's lots of deadlines coming up. If you have to change your address or get registered to vote, you can do that. You can do that on the State Board of Elections website. That'll take you to your county board. All the information's right there. We're urging folks to get out and vote in all the different ways. There's lots of opportunities to vote this year. You can vote by absentee ballot if you need to. You can vote early in person. There's a whole week of that. And then there's Election Day, November 8th. So we're working to get out the vote too. If your organization is interested in learning more about the Bond Act or would like to join our coalition, if you're not part of it yet, I think we're up to almost 300 organizations. You can go to voteyescleanwaterandjobs.com. You can, if you do that, you can see more information about the Bond Act. On the coalition page, you can actually sign your organization up. We have a whole toolkit of materials that can be used to get the word out. And as a voter, you can take a pledge to vote, and we'd be happy to send you reminders about the Bond Act, what it is, and to get out there and vote for it as election season progresses. So with that, I'll stop sharing, and I'm happy to take a couple of questions if there's time.
Thank you very much, Jessica. We appreciate that. So do we have anybody with a question? Yes. Can you come up? If you just.
Get right through here. Should be able to pick you up.
So just one question. So I get my Adirondack Explorer, or Adirondack Life, and with the previous Bond Act, I forget when it was, years ago, apparently it did good things, but there apparently was a lack of documentation. You look back on where all that money went. It was never documented. So if you look back on that and you look back and try to find out where the money went, you can't really document it. So I guess my question is, will there be better documentation with this Bond Act of where the money actually flows?
Yeah, I was disappointed to see the response to that press inquiry in the Explorer. And, the good news is the Bond Act that we're talking about now is subject to annual reporting requirements, and the reports are required to be delivered not only to the state legislature for oversight, but also posted publicly online. And so, this will allow not only the legislature to really perform its oversight duty, but also members of the public and, of course, the media to have a clear view on how these dollars are being spent.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? Yes, go ahead, Jake. I think she can hear you. Just
okay. Well, I'll lean forward anyway. I'm already up. So Archie Kramer and I went and saw a presentation from Tom Reed, who was talking about the federal monies that have been provided to New York State. I forgot what the numbers are, and it's been too long for me to remember all the details, but they were massive amounts of money for clean water and improvement of our water in New York State. And I think a lot of it might have been going into wastewater treatment plants and water, drinking water improvements. Can you tell us how this lines up with all that federal money? Is it going to be a piggyback type of situation? Maybe explain why we need this if we have all these federal funds coming in.
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're right onto it. This will be a really great opportunity for leverage for New York State. A lot of those federal programs require match. And so this is an opportunity to provide that, and then also an opportunity to, create supplemental funding to pay for larger programs on the infrastructure side. According to New York State DEC and the New York State Department of Health, they estimated several years ago that we need $80 billion of work on our drinking water and wastewater systems combined in New York State, which is tremendous. So, certainly this Bond Act will provide pieces of that, as would the federal funding, as will the state's Water Infrastructure Improvement Act, which is separate and already approved, and that's provided about $4.5 billion since 2016 for clean water. So we're working really hard to piece together funding that's needed for this really extraordinary gap that exists because we've underinvested in our water infrastructure over the years. And then I'll just say, particularly of interest probably to this group is the fact that that there has been kind of a significant underinvestment or lack of attention in the need to invest in natural resources restoration to improve water quality in New York State. And so not only is this bond act geared at those hard infrastructure costs, which are certainly a big priority, but there's also funding in here for the restoration of the natural resources that we know can help us with delivering clean water and also provide important wildlife habitat around our lakes and our rivers and our bays in New York State.
Okay.
I
Can you
see
also
there's-
address it? Oh, I'm sorry. Is
Oh, go
there
ahead.
any funding in there for agricultural runoff, which is a big
Yeah,
issue?
there is specifically. I don't have my handy chart in front of me, so just give me 1 second. But there's definitely, yeah, in the water quality and improvement program, there's eligible projects that include reducing runoff from farms and improving soil health, as well as improving riparian buffers. So there's specifically language in the appropriation that would allow funding to be spent on that.
Thank you.
Yep. And then, hi, Frank, are you going to ask the questions you put in the chat?
I guess I can, maybe I can reiterate. So I was just, I'm just assuming, and maybe you mentioned this in your presentation, I missed it, but that this is a evolution of the initial Mother Nature Bond Act. Then the pandemic hit and we had to change things. But I remember in that proposal, there was an increase of access to New York State waters. And one of the things that kind of we picked up on that conversation was to see if there could be a way of also following suit with increasing access, that there's an increase of protection of the waters related to that migration of boats and access related to aquatic invasive species and support for the prevention of that, moving it from water body to water body, and didn't know if there's, a bit more on that through that act or through this.
Yeah, so good questions. The first question about the Mother Nature Bond Act. Yes, this is a bigger, better environmental bond act. It has a name that makes more sense to more people, and it is larger. We were bummed that the bond act was removed from the ballot in 2020, but we were negotiating with the legislature, and that state budget was being finalized as the whole country was closing down. And so it was not an ideal moment to put something on the ballot. So that was delayed. And in the time it was delayed, it was enlarged. And really kind of the good news is the core issues that were being addressed by the Bond Act remain the same. And that's, I think, in my opinion, really great, because this Bond Act is really geared at some of the most pressing issues facing New Yorkers. To your second question, there is a lot of funding here for projects like shoreline restoration, coastal rehabilitation, waterfront revitalization, as well as increasing parks and communities. So there's a lot of angles as to where you could use that for accessing waterfronts. On the invasive species side, the Bond Act is a mechanism to provide capital funding. It's not a mechanism that can increase any kind of like stream protection laws or water quality laws. It doesn't impose any additional regulations. And it's also not a funding source for what I'll call soft costs, or, things like people, or, like patrols for boat washing and, the people who are washing the boats. It might be a place where you could get funding though for things like the boat washing station and the infrastructure. So that to the extent that there's capital expenses associated with that, I do believe they could be funded. I'll also say that, this is a great coming in concert, not only with the federal funding, but a great opportunity at the state level, also through the state's Environmental Protection Fund, which was increased by $100 million in this current state budget. And as an advocate, we're going to be working to make sure that that 400 million is the bar now that we've set for each fiscal year for New York State. And that is the program that funds New York State's, as I'm sure all of the PRISMs and the invasive species work. So again, this is an opportunity to marry different funding sources. Some funding sources are able to pay for different types of programs, and some are limited, like this one, to capital costs. And so as we build out New York's environmental funding, we can solve a lot of these problems by utilizing these things in tandem. And moving projects forward that way.
Thanks, Jessica. Great to see you.
Good to see you too, Frank.
Okay, thank you very much, Jessica. I think we're all set down with questions. Anybody else? No. Well, thank you so much for sharing, Jessica. We really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for inviting me, and